Well, hello everyone. It looks like people are starting to join in. I see Chisato waving. Nice to see you. Hello everyone. Hope everyone's having a good Thursday afternoon. Wow, I see some of my students. Nice to see you. Well, I am coming live to you from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which, believe it or not, was snowing about an hour ago, and now the sun is shining. So, very interesting times, indeed, for a lot of different reasons. But I hope everyone's doing well. I couldn't be more thrilled to be talking to you all today about a topic I feel pretty strongly about. Uh, for those who do not know who I am, my name is Nicki Roman. I am the saxophone professor at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, where I am about to finish up my second year here in a way I didn't anticipate finishing, but like everyone else in this community, we're finding many creative ways to learn and teach and continue to grow. And I want to say a huge thank you to Nathan Nab for setting all of this up. It's one of these really great positive waves that have been happening during this time, and I know I can speak for myself and many others that this has been a really great platform to continue to inspire students and players and be motivated individually. So again, thank you, Nathan, for setting this up. So when Nathan first reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested on presenting a topic, there were so many things that I wanted to talk about, and when I was looking at all these other really fantastic topics, I thought, what would be a better time than to talk about how I warm up and ways it's worked really well for me, both as a student and now kind of on the other side of things, but still continuing to grow. And it really, this topic that I'm going to talk on, I've presented on a couple times in a variety of different settings, and it stemmed from not too long ago when I was getting asked several times, Nicki, how do you work on your sound, and how do you have a cohesive sound throughout the entire range of the horn? And when I was younger, that question frustrated me sometimes because I found it quite difficult to answer. I always thought, well, your sound is just an extension of who you are. In a lot of ways it is. And the coming months after that, I was thinking more about it and realizing that a lot of it had to do with how I was warming up. And how I warm up is an extension of my sound. And how I warm up is really who I am as a player, who I want to sound like, what I want to sound like that day, not who I want to sound with, but what I want to sound like. And so starting to talk about warming up and how it's an extension of who I am and how it helps me in developing a cohesive sound is really important. And it's something that I think is important no matter what stage you are at your playing. And the other side of this, it came from asking prospective students and current students how they would warm up, and I would always get the term of long tones, and that's great, and long tones are really great, but sometimes asking students what their long tones weren't quite specific enough, and you could tell that by just being a little more detailed in how you warm up helps a lot in kind of setting your success up for that day. For me, warming up has a lot to do with intonation and vibrato, which is going to kind of be the exercises I work through as I'm warming up. And a lot of different performers have different types of ways to warm up, and this is just really what's worked for me for a lot of different reasons, which I'll get into a little bit. But warming up right now, I think, is really crucial, especially in today's climate where a recital is getting canceled or you're reevaluating your repertoire and you have more time for fundamentals. And I think that's so crucial in a lot of different ways. Before I kind of dive right into it, I do recommend, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. If it's something that I'm currently speaking on at that moment, I think Nathan's going to dive in and throw out the question so I can hear it. And then at the end, I'm very open to answering questions you might have, whether it be about this topic or different experiences I've had or a pedagogical question in general. I'm really happy to answer any of those questions beyond just warming up. The other thing I want to mention is if you do have your saxophone, you can get it out and work through these warm-ups with me if you'd like. You can kind of approach it. I told my studio I think this week, that you can kind of approach it like you're watching the Food Network. If someone's cooking along or someone's cooking on the screen and you want to cook along with them, feel free. Just make sure your microphone is muted, although I think it probably already is. But feel free to do so. I do have a slide kind of presentation on the screen. It's nothing really fancy, bells and wheels and whistles or anything, but it kind of just, if you want to look at these exercises and you're more of a visual person, it's going to kind of follow along with what I'm talking about. So I mentioned that I think it's pretty important to have a good warm-up during this time. I included an article on here that I'm happy to send out after, but I came across it a couple days ago and just threw it in here after having conversations with a lot of students and colleagues about aspects of staying motivated, and it's actually a conversation I've been having time and time again these last couple weeks as we've been transitioning online. And it's through the Atlanta Institute of Music and Media, and they give a really great list of ways you can stay motivated if you're someone who's trying to find creative ways to continue to stay motivated now that we're kind of working from home and practicing from home. Some of these things are working on new material, taking on old projects. You can journal your thoughts, which is something that to me correlates to practicing and journaling my practicing. Another thing I've been revisiting is old standards that I played in high school and during my undergraduate to relearn scores and learn them even more efficiently and effectively. And I told Ricky I'd give him a shout out, but he recently sent me some live piano accompaniment tracks that I've been working through instead of using some MIDI tracks. So that's a shout out to Ricky. That's been a really fun resource to use. And with all that being said, I think warming up is really, really important right now, especially during this downtime. I think, in fact, it's crucial. Some benefits to having an effective warm-up, which in some ways I think are pretty obvious, and in other ways something worth thinking about more. Your warm-up should always inform your repertoire. And I don't think enough of us think in that way. The warm-up regime I'm going to kind of work through is a vibrato and intonation warm-up, but I also have other ways I warm up depending on the repertoire I'm about to practice. I always like to think of the beginning of Iber or the beginning of the second movement of Iber. If I'm gonna, my first piece of repertoire I'm gonna practice that day is gonna be the beginning of the second movement, I might do more of the warm-up I'm gonna introduce or talk through today. If I'm gonna begin with the first movement of Iber, I might have my articulation kind of workout I do at the beginning of a practice session, which I'm happy to talk through if anyone has any questions at the end. But your warm-up informing your repertoire is so crucial. It's like being an athlete. You never just start to run a marathon before you stretch and do a lot of different things. We have a student athlete in our studio at Milwaukee, and I've learned kind of a lot about, especially this year, the correlation between really being an athlete and being a musician. They go hand in hand, and so your warm-up informing your repertoire is really, really crucial. Another benefit is it gives you a target area in mind that you should always have. You should never get into the practice room and start warming up and not really keeping your mind engaged about why you're warming up. It's not just to fill time and say, okay, here's my 30 minutes of warm-up and now I'm ready to go. For me, I might think, today I need 40 minutes to warm up. Today I need an hour to warm up. It depends. If you didn't play the day before, your warm-up might look different than if you played 12 hours the day before. That's very, very different because your face is definitely feeling the burn if you played 12 hours the day before. Your face is definitely feeling the burn if you didn't play the day before. So things like that are important to keep in mind. It also leads to efficiency. I'm sure many of you watching are students, and it's really important to be efficient. Some of you might be watching that are teachers. It's also important to be efficient because when you transition from that student to whatever career you end up doing post-student life, being efficient is really important because you usually actually always have less time to practice. So it's really something that I think can be kept in mind at any level you're at. And it also allows for really deep questions at all levels of your saxophone playing, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. Some issues that I think come into play with not having an efficient warm-up. One, it's a waste of time, which is the obvious. You might think you're doing long tones and warming up, but sometimes it's too generic. It's not specific enough. And also, something that I think is important to note is your teacher knows if you're not warming up for your lesson. They usually know. If they'll either say, have you warmed up today? Or sometimes maybe they won't say it. But speaking from a teacher's standpoint, it's very obvious when a student is not warming up, whether that be like before a lesson or before some type of performance. But making sure you're warming up before something really important is so crucial and is a good habit to get into. So now I'm going to go into kind of my warm-up specifics. I do want to note that I am going to go through my warm-up, but I don't think there's really one perfect way to warm up. A lot of what my warm-up consists of is things I've kind of incorporated along the way. I've studied with a lot of different teachers, and I've kind of picked things from all of them and kind of formulated my warm-up, and it's evolved over the years, and I think everyone's warm-up should evolve over the years, and I think that's what keeps warming up exciting for a lot of different reasons. And so I definitely want you to keep in mind that there might be things in here that go against what your teacher says, and there might be things in here that you want to just plug into a little bit of this warm-up you're already doing, and so I think that's important to note. My warm-up stems from my embouchure, my tongue position, and my airstream. And at kind of the umbrella of all of that is intonation, and keeping that in mind as well. But a lot of these exercises I do, I've found warm up my embouchure, my vibrato really feels spinning at the end of this process. I feel ready to go on whatever material I'm going to work on after, and my intonation really feels solid. And for me, that is in 3 parts. That is vibrato exercises at the beginning. The second part, or the second unit of that, is an extension. It's vibrato exercises with the metronome, and a drone. And then that third section is going to be drone work, more improvisation based, and turning off the metronome. And so I'm going to kind of work through these different exercises that work really well for me, and I actually do these every single day for the most part, and they really set me up. They make me feel grounded. In a lot of ways, I feel like warming up is meditation for me. It's the bread and butter of what I do, and sometimes even if I don't quite get to do a full warm-up, I'm not in the best mood, and I'm sure some can relate to that. Like if you really get to do your solid warm-up, you feel ready to go for the day, and so it's kind of like the carbs of my saxophone playing, so to speak. And so with that in mind, let's jump right into it. So I'm gonna break down a little bit about how I approach vibrato and how I practice it, especially since this is the first part of my warm-up. Some of you might think, well, Nicki, you're crazy. Why are you adding your vibrato right away? That's because it's really well connected to my embouchure. And so getting these muscles to work correctly is really important in building a solid foundation, and what I want to practice later in my practice session, which I mentioned. The very first thing I do, besides playing mouthpiece pitches, which I'm not going to cover today, that's like a whole nother part of my warm-up, but I'll usually play mouthpiece pitches first, which is something I can talk about later if someone has a question about that. But it's really it starts first with something called the C scoop, and it's really getting my muscles engaged, making sure I'm using a good airstream. It's something that Professor Deborah Rickmeyer uses a lot, and in a lot of ways I think she coined the C scoop, at least in my life. The first time it was explained to me was by her. And I'll pick up the horn, and the very first thing I do is I really start to think about kind of how my muscles are engaged and how they're feeling that day. That's important to note. And so doing this on a middle C is really good because it's a non-resistant note, and I'll just do a couple scoops, really making sure the vibrato muscles and the embouchure muscles are being engaged. Engaged is really important. So it'll sound something like this. actually feels pretty good today. I tried really hard to not warm up before this talk today, although I did teach some and did play the saxophone. I tried to not warm up so that you really could hear what it sounds like when I start to warm up for the day. Couple things to know when I'm doing this. I want to hear that my ear is really latching on to every little microtone, so I'm feeling the movement. It's not an interval exercise. It's feeling the muscles and making sure they're really engaged. How's my airstream? Is it backing off? When I'm doing this scoop down, I want to make sure my airstream is really pushing through the horn, so it's always relating back to air. That's so important to me. From there, you'll notice I'm still not putting on the metronome yet because I don't like to feel kind of confined to a box early on in the day, because your warm-up is usually early on in the day. So I'll start to do these scoops and allow it to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and let my vibrato really get into kind of a spinning motion. So it'll sound something like this. And I'll do that a lot. And I'll sit on middle C for a while, and sometimes I'll go above the note or right below. But the step after this is when I'll start to kind of extend the range on the horn. For interest of time, I won't keep doing this, but I'll sit on this for a while, really depending on how much time I have or how I'm feeling that day. I want to make sure I covered everything that I wanted to say about that. And I did mention I don't like to feel confined to a metronome right away, so I don't add that quite yet. So if you can see this slide on the screen, which you should be able to, these are the top two exercises are ones I like to follow. They're nothing really fancy, and you might have heard them before, but what I like about them is they really make me feel set up for the day. The first exercise starts with 2 beats of straight tone and then works its way into the vibrato. I always like to start with 2 beats of straight tone because I'm really thinking about how I'm getting from a solid foundation and then incorporating vibrato. Vibrato is really a core part of our sound. It shouldn't be something that really takes away from it, which is something important to note if you're a younger student. So the first exercise I like to do is that first one, starting at 60 beats per minute. And the vibrato is the rhythms you see, starting on beat 3. I always start at 60 usually. You'll see in exercise 2 I have a tempo range of 60 to 84. Realistically, I don't really even get to 84 that often because I find it's quite fast for the type of vibrato I like to use, but that's just a vibrato range that you see quite often, and it's a range that I like to live by, but I always like to start at 60. And I'll pick a scale for that day. It might be a scale that's in a piece of repertoire I've been working on. It might be a scale that I'm living in that key a lot. But in general, I like to pick 3 keys per warm-up practice session. I'll explain that a little bit more as I go along. But I'm going to pick my A major scale, and I'm going to do exercise number 1. Probably not all the way up an octave, but just a few notes to kind of, if you haven't done this exercise before, this is what it would sound like. Into the altissimo. I think it's important to note that with all of these exercises, you really want to work towards extending the range too, and working on your sound throughout the entire range of the horn. For me, it's definitely full range and beyond. Usually I go to the highest octave I can play. Sometimes I go to the highest fifth I can play, but I'm really working on my altissimo. For those in the chat that don't quite have a solid altissimo register yet, this is a really good way to begin to doing so. And by starting to work towards vibrato in the altissimo, it really teaches you to be in that solid foundation just in your warm-up, which is really important. So I'll go through exercise 1, but for me, I live a lot with exercise 2. I like to put exercise 1 on there because I've found with younger students, exercise 1 works really well, sometimes more than exercise 2, because what exercise 1 is doing is essentially teaching you to play your vibrato in different rhythms and different tempi within just kind of keeping your metronome at the same tempo. So that's important to note. I usually do my 3 keys on exercise 1, and then I'm already moving on to exercise 2. Exercise 2 is quite simple. It's 2 beats of straight tone and 2 beats of 16th notes, and I'm going to pick my 3 keys. I'm going to stick with A because I like how A feels right now. Maybe it's Thursday is for the key of A. I don't think any of my repertoire is currently in A, although it probably is at some point. But it's just I'm feeling good about A right now. So now I'm going to do exercise number 2. I'm going to start at 60 again. And I'm going to ascend first. I'm going to start on middle A, and I like to ascend, go all the way up, come back down, then descend. Just so I'm starting in a comfortable range of the instrument, and I'm not starting on something that's going to kill me like a low B flat at the beginning of the day. And I think that's important. So it'll be something like this. Now I have to breathe. We all have to breathe. I don't circular breathe in this warm-up because I don't find it necessary, and I actually think it kind of hurts how I'm working on my airstream. When I do breathe, I come back in straight tone, so I'm really continuing to work on kind of the sustain aspect of this, and I'll continue up. I'll pretend I skipped a bunch of notes, and then I go all the way up to the altissimo. So I'll skip a few notes and start a little higher. And then I'll really feel like I'm working on the full range of the horn, and I'm working on spinning my sound and using a good airstream. Once I've done that, I then go back to middle A, and I'm going to descend. And likewise. I think it's important to note that what you do with your vibrato is not different on every single note, because every note has a different sense of resistance. So while I'm doing this, I'm going to keep thinking back to that C scoop. And if I have a specific note that's really not spinning that day, I'll go back and I'll do that exercise on that particular note. And I do this quite frequently, especially on that first scale on exercise 2. A note that's notorious for me is B, just octave B. For some reason, how I've been feeling these last few months is, wow, that note is really difficult for me to spin my vibrato on compared to a middle C. So I'll sit on it for a while, and I'll really make sure I'm feeling that I'm moving the right muscles. And again, it's warming up the embouchure a lot. I'll probably do it again. And then I'll kind of go into that larger spin that gradually gets smaller. Until it gets into a spinning motion. Some of you might be wondering what syllable I think when I think of vibrato, and I know a lot of teachers out there teach a different syllable. For me, it's ya, and I teach ya to my students. I always have to say ya, not yeah, like they're from Wisconsin, because they tend to have Wisconsin accents. So ya is a syllable I teach. I know many teach va or wah, or I have students that come from a va background that might have a really fantastic spinning vibrato. But when I'm starting students young with vibrato, ya is a syllable that I tend to teach, and it's one that I use in my own playing with myself and with my students. And so when I'm doing this bend, I'm really thinking of a lot of different things, and the syllable is quite important. So that's what I'll do with A. I'll continue on 60 and I'll pick 2 other keys. I do that because I want to make sure I'm covering every note on the saxophone, but I would not like to sit there and play a chromatic scale on this exercise. I think a lot about expression and keeping my ears engaged and really note connection, and I find myself more motivated to practice my long tones in this way when I'm doing it on types of scales and not the chromatic scale specifically. So for me today, I think the next scale I'm going to pick is my B-flat scale. And I'm going to go through that again. Now I'm going to start on the 2nd octave because I'm feeling a little more warmed up, or the 3rd octave, so to speak. So high B-flat, and I'm going to go up into the altissimo on exercise 2. And if I hear some kind of crack or something, I'll do some series of pitch bends, but what I'm really focusing on right now is spinning my vibrato in this range, making sure my tongue is staying up, and then I'm getting a cohesive sound throughout the horn. And I didn't really love my spinning vibrato on that altissimo B, so I'll probably go and do some scoops. So I'm kind of showing you how much my ear is really thinking about while I'm doing my warm-up. It really keeps me more excited while I'm practicing, and so I'll do a series of kind of that scoop process on that note. And something I talk to my students about a lot, this is helping target areas, is how you vibrate on a middle C is very different than an altissimo B flat. If I did the same motion on a middle C, on an altissimo B flat as I did on a middle C, it would sound something like this, which is not really fitting the type of vibrato I'm aiming to practice at this moment. So I think that's important to note. So that's the exercise I do through 3 different keys with metronome work. This takes some time, and then I'll go through the tempo 60. Then I bump up the tempo. I'll either go to 64 or 66. That's just me. I don't really love odd numbers when I'm bumping up the metronome. It's probably because when I was really young, I had one of those metronomes that only went up in even numbers, and I've just lived my life that way since. And so there's no really fancy reason as to why I move it up 4 and not 5. But that's just the regime I've gotten used to doing. So now I'm at 66, and I'm going to do those same 3 keys again.
Hey, Nicki.
Yep.
We have a few questions here that I thought maybe we would want to address really fast.
Sure. Yeah.
Some of them are bigger picture that you might want to address at the end. Some of them are smaller.
Sure.
One of them was, for these exercises, do you just play the highest note you can in the scale if you can't play altissimo?
Good question. I usually have my students, and when I was younger doing this, have them do just the full range of the scale. So if they're doing their E flat major scale, I'll have them go up to palm F. But yeah, going up to the highest note you can play comfortably in that scale is good. If you're still really working on your altissimo, like just really G, G sharp A, it might not even be needed in this exercise, especially if it's something you're still really working on just controlling, then you don't want to hurt yourself while you're warming up. So usually I'll just have students just work through the palm keys in their full range version of that scale. The altissimo part of this really I didn't start doing towards the end of my undergrad and early graduate school days to kind of work on the intonation aspect of it too in voicing. So it's important not to really kill yourself in the altissimo register and think you need to fit this in. Just a full range scale will get just as much done even if you're a doctoral student. So Yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Okay. And then good. Does the syllable have a feel of movement, like jaw, chin, or lip, or does that matter when you're teaching it?
When I'm teaching vibrato, the motion is in some ways important. I try to make sure my students don't get too bogged down by that, because I found with younger students, they start to get a lot of external movement that you can see, which is a red flag. And so the syllable in a lot of ways is important. I also tell my students a lot of times to focus on the top portion of the jaw vibrato. They tend to not be engaging this portion. So especially for me, vibrato and articulation are the first things that leave my playing if I'm not getting enough time on the horn. And I found that focusing on this is really important and keeping it engaged. So I teach more through engagement and less of the movement at the forefront, because then they're overdoing the movement in some ways, and it's really hard to correct that once you start over moving kind of the bottom jaw. So I try to really focus in on, I think of the 4 points coming in diagonally, which a lot of you have probably seen that excerpt or picture before. My students like to make fun of me for it, and they draw it on different boards, but it's a circle with 4 diagonal points coming in. And that's really important for me in terms of what's being engaged, and really thinking when you're saying yeah, feeling this. And so all of that's really warming up my embouchure too, which is so helpful and crucial for me when I'm first picking up the horn, because all of it's connected to what we do.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and then here's a bigger one that you can either choose to answer now or later, but
Well, okay.
from Gabe PK and seconded by.
Is it really?
So.
Who's the second? Is it Harrison Clark? Is that who you said? Oh, I don't know who those guys are.
Talk about some of the common problems you see with vibrato.
Yeah. Talk about the common problems? Sure. I think the first common one is students that are thinking they're actually vibrating on the instrument and you can't audibly hear it. That's really the first one. When I get students that come in freshman year that already have a vibrato that's already a part of their sound, getting them to spin more is something that we have to work on quite a bit, because a lot of times they think they're doing it, and just simply having them record themselves and hearing how it's not actually that present in the sound is a common aspect of vibrato that happens quite a bit that I found in my teaching. Another aspect that's something that I've noticed a lot is getting them to just implement it into repertoire and into their music. There's so many times that students are working on these exercises, but then actually getting it into the music is really important. And so if you actually see on the screen right now where it says other, these exercises at the bottom is usually, I don't always add this into my warm-up, but I actually included it on the screen to kind of show what the next step could be in just practicing your vibrato. So when I'm just sitting down to just practice my vibrato, which might be different than my actual warm-up, I'll do these exercises at the bottom, and I have my students do these a lot, which you can put the metronome on. You should put the metronome on, but you're not assigning rhythm to it, and you're really just using the metronome as a guidepost for tempi and dynamics. And so I teach a lot for dynamics with vibrato, really to get students to get comfortable adding it into repertoire. So this, and I know students work on this at other institutions as well, but this leaves a lot of room for freedom, and this gets them to start to put it into repertoire. I always think of Bozza aria, kind of the vibrato staple piece. That's a piece I give a lot to even mature students who need to spend more time implementing it more and just making it more present. So the exercise at the bottom can be a lot of different ways, but it's really scaling the vibrato over 4 beats. That could either be from niente to a more present vibrato into niente. It could be a slower vibrato into a faster vibrato. And I sometimes do it over 16 beats or 8 beats or 2 and 2. But really getting students to have a more present vibrato. The movement is really big. They're overdoing the movement and they're not engaging the top part of the jaw. Sometimes I'll ask students, how do you vibrate on the saxophone? Sometimes I'll ask that in prospective student auditions just to kind of see what their background is. And I get answers of the bottom lip a lot, which is not the most efficient way, I think, to view the vibrato because it's affecting the core sound a lot. And I think I mentioned this earlier on, but vibrato to me is something, to everyone, is something that adds to the sound. It's not something that should be distracting. And then the other common thing that happens is I don't think students practice their vibrato enough. I think once they think they got it, it's done, and then they don't need to practice it anymore. But I think it's something that has to evolve over time and be worked into your playing. And it's something that I really make sure my graduate students are practicing too, because I think it's really easy to get stuck in having a vibrato from a younger age and then not continuing to develop it. I mean, my vibrato is completely different now than it was even 2 years ago because I'm kind of practicing it in different ways and making sure it's adding to the sound I want. And so just the simplicity of practicing vibrato is really common for students to not practice vibrato. So yeah, that's my multi-tiered answer to my fellow Fuego Quartet mates.
Yeah. So there were a few others coming in, but I don't want to derail you too much. Why don't we wait until later to answer?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I got through exercise 2, and I already kind of mentioned this, but the other at the bottom of the screen is just some other examples of what I might work through if I'm not really feeling quite warmed up yet. And I'm just going to go over them one more time. I won't play through them, but I'm going to let my reed soak a little because it's drying out. I'll put that metronome back at 60, but I won't feel confined to a rhythm, which I think is really important. And like I mentioned, it's a good way to, if you're struggling to start to implement this into repertoire, or you're finding that it's somewhat of an on and off switch when you're playing, which is really common, especially if you're kind of at the younger stages of solidifying your vibrato, is 4 beats up and 4 beats down. And I view this in a couple different ways. This could be niente into a more present vibrato into niente, which is something that we like to add sometimes in terms of phrase structure. And then a slower vibrato that gets into a faster vibrato, or a faster vibrato that gets into a slower vibrato. And so this is really a common step for me to go to next. And what I like about these 3 exercises actually, they're just ones I've implemented in different ways over the years. The first exercise I didn't really practice a lot until the last 2 or 3 years when I was teaching it a lot, and talk about an example of you become a better performer when you start to teach more. But I found myself questioning, why am I not adding this to my practicing and in my kind of motions I go through daily. And so I use it quite a bit now, and it's something I probably didn't use 3 or 4 years ago, but it's an example of how my warm-up kind of evolves over time. So now I want to talk a little bit about intonation. I do think people will add intonation into their warm-up at different stages. For me, I add it at this point, kind of in step 3. And I like to do this because I finally feel like the tongue and the embouchure is warmed up enough that I have flexibility to start really working towards intonation. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I put this step first. So it really just depends, but I think it's an important step to just have in your practicing. One thing I do want to talk about is types of drones, because I actually saw this online somewhere. There was some kind of discussion going on of what types of drones do you use when you practice? And I think it was a saxophone professor that was just starting a conversation, and it got me thinking a lot about how many different types of drones we have out there. And I'll sometimes have students that are asking of what types of drones do you use, or I don't have access to drones, and well, that's false. Drones are really easily accessible. The most common one, I think, that not a lot of younger students know about today, and I think that's because of apps, but the tuning CD is really, really fantastic. You can download it on like any major streaming service. It's probably on Spotify now. When I was younger, I was not using Spotify, so I used like the physical CD and uploaded it into my computer. But I also love the tuning CD because it comes in different frequencies. So there's 440. I remember when I was a student at Eastman, ESP was going to China, so I actually practiced the tuning CD at a higher pitch frequency, and it helped me a lot because we were playing with piano. The cello drones are really great. I actually sometimes like the cello drones more because they're a little more meditative. If I'm doing this exercise on tenor, or baritone, like on a lower horn, specifically tenor. I'll use the cello drones because the frequency matches more. In my office, which I am not in, I'll use my DB90, my Dr. Beat, because what I like about the Dr. Beat is if you have access to one, it's so many different octaves. So especially as a younger student that's working on drones, I've found it more helpful for them to actually be practicing drone work in the true octave because it's a closer frequency that they can hear. And then if you're really, you've already got one, which is fantastic. It's one of those Peterson strobe tuners, which is awesome. All of these are really great, and there's so many really good apps to use. I have a couple on the screen, but there's so many apps that have drones now. My only reservation about the apps is sometimes they don't quite get loud enough, but the apps are also really good. So how do I put this into context? I got my tuning CD that I've been practicing here on my iPad the last few weeks. And I use the tuning CD quite a bit, and I've been using it a lot recently because I'm kind of locked out of my office and I can't get my Dr. Beat. And so, but the tuning CD really serves the same function. And so I go through the same process that I did with the metronome work, but now I'm adding in the drone. And this is really important to be practicing your vibrato with the drone because you really need to be thinking about your intonation while you're doing all this. You're starting to do some manipulation and you didn't make sure the pitch is staying up. The tendency is the pitch to drop. And so this is really important and keeping an engaged ear. So practicing drones, doing drone work at a young age is really important and you should continue to do so. Something that I probably would have benefited from earlier on that I didn't yet incorporate, I incorporated into my playing later than I think I should have, although now I think a lot about intonation all the time, and I think my students can attest to that. I'm quite a stickler for intonation, and a lot of it has to do with my warm-up. And talking about your warm-up being an extension of your playing, intonation is like a really core part of my playing, and I realized that when I started hearing younger students, and when they started playing more, this simplicity of just playing more in tune really helped their sound and opened up their ear. So intonation is really important. I just want to put that plug. So I go back to 60 and I do those 3 keys now with the drone. Then I bump it up to 66. I do those 3 keys again with the drone. I'll bump it up to 72. And this whole process takes usually 30 to 40 minutes for me. But again, one day it might be 30, one day it might be 40. So I'll give a brief example of that. I'm going to now go back to 60, and I'm going to go back to my B flat scale. So concert D flat. And I'll just do a little bit of it. This will take me quite some time, but I find it's really, really helpful in terms of really feeling well set up for what I'm about to practice. And I'll go all the way up into the altissimo. Usually if I'm doing my B flat scale, I'll go up to an altissimo B, C, or D, just depending on the day, but I really want to make sure if I have a solid altissimo, I'm getting up there, but by no means is it not just as beneficial just to go up to, say, a palm key F. So I'll go through those 3 keys with the metronome, and I'll rotate them until I get the metronome up to about 72 or 76. And I'm really working on my long tones, my intonation, and my vibrato, and I'm really killing 2 birds with 1 stone, or kind of 3 birds with 1 stone. So I'm sorry, birds. That's just a figure of speech, but that's something that's really, really crucial for me. It takes time and diligence, but it's really revealing in a lot of ways. And what's important to me about it is I'm keeping an engaged ear and I'm correcting things, which is important, and not just kind of going through the motion of warming up. Because I found when I was younger that my warm-ups were just the same every day and I was sounding the same, and I wasn't really making sure to target areas for improvement, because your warm-up is, and I mentioned this probably in the first 10 minutes, is the core part of your sound, and it's the core part of your playing. And if you think a lot about the mental aspect of playing an instrument, which certainly I do, especially as I've gotten older, is it really sets you up mentally for the day. It could be a meditative process, and it certainly is for me. So the last step I do is I turn off the metronome and I keep the drone on, and I start to create larger intervals within this exercise. I like to stick with exercise 2, which, if I'm going back, is that 2 beats of straight tone and 2 beats of vibrato. But I'm doing larger intervals and I'm turning off the metronome because now I'm really focusing in on the artistic aspect of this warm-up and note connection, and making sure my intervals are really fluid for the day and that I'm really matching sound across the horn. So for me, I like to start with major thirds. This is something that I started to do in graduate school that really helped, because I would stop my warm-up with just the metronome work and the drone, and then I felt like I needed more in terms of working on a core sound. And one day I just started playing really slow major thirds and just playing all through the horn, but still keeping the same exercise. And I really loved to warm up. I thrived when it came to warming up by just adding this aspect. And it's nothing really fancy, but it's something that really added some element to my playing in a lot of ways. So it could be something like this. I'll go now back to my A major scale, which is one of my 3 scales I was doing today. And it might be something like this. To start with thirds because I can alternate between sustaining and bumping up and pushing into a resolution. So you'll notice I'm bumping up then pushing down, and I'm really thinking of kind of how I'm getting in and out of each note and then vibrating off of them. And I'll do this all the way into the altissimo, and then I'll descend. And I'll go kind of back up to middle A. And then I'll pick larger intervals and I'll really sit on those notes that I'm thinking about weren't quite spinning in my other 2 exercises that I had to spend, my other 2 parts that I had to spend more time on. And I'll start to kind of deviate away from that. Of time, I'm playing through a little quicker than I would normally, but this next step I'll spend 8, 10, 12, 15 minutes on, and it really helps me a lot. It's important to note that if you're limited for time, you know, I'm sometimes limited for time. I have 10, 15 minutes in between teaching lessons, or I'm coming off of some kind of meeting and I have a 20-minute window or something like that. I'll start with this part, actually. And something I mentioned earlier that I think is a good takeaway is any of these parts I think are useful to be incorporating into a warm-up. This one particularly for me, I tend to start with if I'm limited for time. But choose your battles wisely. If you start here, don't just start in the upper register. I would recommend kind of, if you follow this model, start with some of those C scoops and then move on to this more improvisatory based, larger interval based kind of method. So I'm almost towards the end, and if I think there are a lot of questions, I see like a light blinking, but I just want to kind of show some visual pros and cons to doing this. And in a lot of ways, this could take up to an hour to do this process. And if we had that long, I'd be happy to play through it for an hour, but I don't know if that would be helpful for you all. And just kind of seeing portions of this, I think, are worth exploring in your own warming up. There's so many pros to this, and really the only con is it's time, and I don't think that's a con at all. But it really allows for growth in areas you should be targeting on the saxophone. A warm-up shouldn't just be a one-part thing. It should be really targeting a lot of different things, and I'm sure every single person on this chat right now is a really strong, level-headed player and a creative thinker. You're a musician, so you are a creative thinker. So there's lots of avenues you can explore in your warm-up. It should always inform your repertoire. I do a whole other articulation warm-up if I find that what I'm going to practice is heavily based in articulation. And so this could be something that's informing something you're about to practice, and that's important. I think it creates structure. So if you're a younger student looking for more structure in your practicing, which I found with younger students, structure and how to practice is really important. This is really fantastic for structuring your practicing, especially now. I imagine a lot of you have some more downtime. That structuring your practicing can be really important, and logging it too. And I think it leads to more success in the practice room and room for creativity, really. So in a lot of ways, I think this is really worth exploring in order to have a really consistent warm-up. Consistency is key, and a non-rushed warm-up. So I think that's my last slide. I'm happy. Wow, I see there's like 17 questions. So I think Nathan, do you want to jump back on here and ask them? And then let me not share my screen.
Yeah.
And then I'm happy to stay on here and answer some questions. Everyone can probably, it's non-shared now. Yeah. Okay.
So we left off. There was a question about what are some tips on fixing a vibrato that's too wide? Like what are some ways to control it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first place to look is if it's too wide, to make sure you're looking at yourself in a mirror. A lot of times when the vibrato is too wide, there's a lot of external motion that's going on, whether that be the lip, sometimes the tongue's moving too much. Sometimes with students that are starting to work on vibrato, they stop thinking about the tongue and it's kind of falling flat inside of the mouth. I approach the tongue position in a way that's back of the tongue up, which a lot of you have probably heard before, kind of like the toboggan slide, and the tongue's hugging the molars in the back. If the vibrato is too wide, sometimes the tongue's moving too much, and that's what's manipulating the pitch and the vibration itself. So making sure the tongue's staying up in the back and kind of moving as one with the embouchure is important. For me, doing that C-scoop motion and making sure where I'm ending is not too wide is important, and always thinking of spinning. Spinning forward motion is really crucial for me. I don't want to keep saying with students, because all of these are things I've lived through, but the tongue and the visible movement is really big. You shouldn't really have much visible movement when you're vibrating.
Yeah, along those lines, I think it's important, like when you're talking about the C-scoop, it's just where our embouchure change that we're talking about, not the tongue.
Mm-hmm, right.
And so I think that's, like sometimes, occasionally when people are doing that, they'll engage the tongue in that motion too, which of course help bend the pitch.
Yeah.
Not
here. And that's why I've really enjoyed teaching vibrato, because once the student starts making sure their tongue in the back is staying up, it helps a lot of other aspects of their playing too, which that is a huge thing that every young undergraduate student and even graduate students working on, is consistency with keeping the tongue up in the back. For me, that's why I mentioned at the beginning, is why I always start with mouthpiece pitches, is making sure the tongue's staying up in the back. But yeah, making sure the tongue is not moving, because that's just so much more extra movement that shouldn't be happening, and it's in the end going to be a lot harder to fix later on.
Right.
It's just like fixing these bad habits. So
right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another one is this is from Olivia. When is a good time to introduce vibrato to young students or beginners?
I like to introduce it pretty early on, because I found with older students, it's really hard to teach. and in a lot of ways takes longer to learn. So I'll teach it to students pretty early on, making sure, and that might mean they're just doing those exercises for a while. But I think the earlier the better, as long as they're fundamentally set up properly. So if I have a really young student and I've started them from day one, I'll start teaching them vibrato early on. I don't have a set method of every brand new student that is in blah 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 grade I'm going to teach them in the second month. I try to be sensitive to every player is different, but certainly if you can get a student that you get them on day one and you're making sure you're setting up their tongue position correctly and their embouchure correctly, the vibrato can be a tool that really helps a younger student that
Right.
sometimes takes longer to learn when they're older. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question since we're on this. I'm gonna
Uh-oh.
invoke and do you ever invert the vibrato exercises? Well, it's a two-part question. One, do you make sure that the rhythm that you're using for vibrato, it's the bottom of the wave that is the rhythm?
Uh, I think more about the syllable and where the syllable starts. So making sure the ya starts right on the downbeat of whatever that rhythm is. Because
Yeah.
sometimes they do flip it and
Yeah.
it's really difficult. And like I teach YAH and
Right.
the H is the rhythm. So I have to remind them the ya is right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because they can emphasize the upside of it, which causes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those are usually students for me that are moving too much and overdoing everything. Yeah.
Do you also ever invert the rhythm? Do you start faster and move slower?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Not necessarily with younger students, but I do that with older students, and I do that too. Speaking about the depending on the day and the warm up, but I'll flip it a lot. A lot of my articulation exercises that I do, I flip too,
Yep.
because they kind of have a similar formula. I'm someone that likes consistency, so yeah.
Right. And on top of it, sometimes you need that vibrato to spin immediately on the
Right away.
line. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
great. Okay. From Luke, I thought I had a vibrato for years, but through my air, so I'm trying to work on doing it correctly. Thought mine was wide, but it just wasn't wide enough. And now when I practice it, I think it's too wide. How do you know when it's actually correct? Because since since when you're practicing there isn't an audience, it's kind of difficult to determine that.
Yeah. I think the number one is you need to record yourself. You're your biggest critic. My vibrato never got better until I started recording these warm-ups. And that had a lot to do with Professor Rickmeyer and telling me I needed to record myself during my warm-ups. But you're your best critic, and recording yourself using vibrato is such a huge tool, especially right now. And record your lessons too. Hopefully all the students here are recording their lessons. That's a huge tool. But recording yourself is a really good way to tell if it's too wide. That's really, really important. Something that helped me so much because for an example, mine got too wide at a certain point in my life. I think it happens with a lot of people, depending on the repertoire you're playing, but recording yourself can be really helpful. I know some people use those apps that, if Gabe's still on this chat, I know he does this, uses the app that shows the frequency of somehow how you're moving. I feel too locked into that when I do that, but that helps some people and might help you if you're a visual person. But for me, the recording is really huge because it is really easy to go overboard as you practice your vibrato. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the app is tunable, the one he's referring to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So I've seen success with my own students doing that quite a bit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, here's another one. Do you have any advice as to how to make vibrato smoother and if visually, speaking of that, visually appear more like a sine curve as opposed to a jagged line?
The spinning is really big to me. Sometimes I explain it as like an infinity symbol that's forever spinning. And something that's just starting to come into your playing, but the airstream's really big, and it's why I do that scoop and that process of pushing the air through the horn. In those exercises, something that I didn't get a chance to mention is sometimes I'll put crescendi within the exercise to make sure it's spinning. Sometimes as we start to get louder in our vibrato and we spin forward, we get really jagged, and we get kind of like if you're in the doctor's office and you see that monitor, I use that reference a lot, but thinking of spinning in terms of crescendoing. And I find as I get louder, I rely more on the air and less of the actual movement. Like if you're putting more air through the horn, you can rely less on this jaw motion and more of the airstream kind of doing the work itself too, which I relate to articulation too. Like a lot of times more air and less tongue really is the key to getting a faster, crisper, cohesive articulation.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So part of the thing with the C scoop too is finding the thresholds,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
and,
Yeah.
and then avoiding. All right. So from Roy, do you approach a vibrato differently as far as speed and width in different registers of the saxophone?
Um, Depends on what I'm playing, really. And I think a lot of this can relate to what you're playing, but what's really important to me is I'm just simply moving less as I get higher on the horn. It's a lot more sensitive up there. A lot of times in the altissimo, just slightly thinking of saying the yaw syllable gets you a spinning vibrato. I think I referenced that a little bit, but and I relate this to like almost every technique on the saxophone, but as you get higher, it's less movement, and that's really important. With younger students, they think moving the same amount in the palm keys is going to get you the same spinning vibrato, and it's so micro and so much less the higher you get. So I think a lot about how I'm just doing a little bit less as I get higher, which I think is something that should be exciting for younger students to know, that in a lot of ways you don't need to work so hard in the upper register. So that's a big way I approach it in the upper register,
Sure.
and kind of bridging the gap.
Uh,
Thanks, Roy.
yeah. Do you have any suggestions as far as how to get vibrato to move smoothly between notes without stopping or making it sound like each note has its own vibrato?
So that's why I do the exercise of intervals. And what I found is when I do this, I'm focusing a lot on note connection, um, and putting air through the horn and thinking of how I'm getting into things. When I do this exercise, I actually just envision I'm playing a phrase, which I think is something you can take away in any kind of warm-up you do. Is it's not an exercise. It's really warming you up for the day, but it's something that helps me a lot. So something like a I'm focusing on how like my sound is going over the break and things like that. So I might do an interval exercise where I jump a leap and then go straight into vibrato on a lower pitch. So I'm focusing on really, it can be, you can view it as technical too, making sure closing the keys right in time and pushing the air in line with that. But that's why I usually, if I'm limited for time, will start there. And so sometimes just starting there is really helpful, and working on note connection. And doing this in the altissimo is huge. If there's individuals out there, which I'm sure there are, working on kind of the finesse of the altissimo, which is something that I'm still working on now and will always be working on. I do this exercise a lot because it's helping me with my voicing and how where my tongue needs to kind of lock into place.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then from Grace, is it still important to put vibrato into a daily warm up if you don't use it very much?
Well, the answer to that, I think, is this Grace, my high school? This is probably Grace, my high school student. Yeah, it's really important because then it's going to get you to start using it more,
Yeah.
especially if you're a younger student. Being comfortable with using vibrato is really hard, not just technically, but just like the mental aspect behind using vibrato feels really out of someone's comfort zone if they're a younger student, I think. That's why the recording is good, but the more you implement it into your practicing, the more you're going to do it in your natural playing. I say that from experience with students and with myself when I was younger. And my sound and my vibrato always goes away quicker if I'm not practicing it. There might be days where I'm like, why is my sound going away, or why don't I sound as cohesive today? And it's, oh, I haven't warmed up that way in a while. So it's a good reminder sometimes too of what you need to revisit.
Yeah. And then we have one more question here. and this is from Chisato. And she, would you talk about using the mouthpiece? Would you talk about using just the mouthpiece that you mentioned in the beginning?
For vibrato. Oh, would I talk about it? Yeah. I teach mouthpiece exercises a lot, like every other teacher. For me, I do it a lot for revealing the shape that the tongue needs to be in, and if the tongue's locking in the right shape. I'll do this a lot with graduate students too, and kind of finessing the altissimo. The mouthpiece is a really important tool for us to have. I come from a family of string players that talk about bow technique, and I think the mouthpiece is related a lot to how string players approach the bow technique.
Mhm.
If you can sound good on the mouthpiece, you can sound better on the saxophone. And that's something that's like at the root of my mouthpiece teaching and pedagogy. But I start there and I just start by blowing an A. For me, it needs to be a loud dynamic because I find sometimes I can cheat the pitch at a softer dynamic when I first pull it out. I'm sure a lot of you know that the common the common thing that happens is students are either really high or really below the pitch. In my experience, it's usually a lot higher because they're just too tight and they're relying more on the lips and less on the tongue to get the pitch up. So I start with an A and then I do really slow interval exercises. For me, what I found not helpful was doing mouthpiece pitches really quickly as an interval exercise. So I do sometimes down to an octave on mouthpiece pitches, but I usually just go to a fifth because I find what I need to fix and what I'm working on with mouthpiece pitches I can achieve just in doing down to a fifth. But I do really slow quarter to half step pitch bends going back to A, then another step. But what I aim for is that second A. Am I coming back to that second A? I think a lot of times we focus a lot on just getting the A and then going down, but we don't focus on getting back. And a lot of times in our playing, we're not always getting back to it. We're starting there, but we'll deviate away in our own playing. So I really focus a lot on the interval exercise slow, making sure my ears are latching on every little microtone, and I need to feel coming back up. So I do that. Sometimes it takes 5 minutes, sometimes it takes 10 minutes, but the mouthpiece pitches are a really core part of playing the saxophone to me. I think that has to do with comparing it to bow technique as a string player. So yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well,
Awesome questions.
yeah, that's it. So,
Awesome.
Nikki, thank you so much. Great to hear your thoughts on this. And
Sure. Thank you.
yeah, and so I guess this will be posted later. So if anybody has other questions, they can ask online.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you. See ya.